Hello and welcome to the second week of this video series, Why Hope? We're in season 1, which is looking at the God who acts in history. And the title for today's video is By Myself I Have Sworn. Now we find these words a couple of times in the Old Testament, and then they're referred to in the New, as I'll show you in a minute. We find them in Genesis 22 when God is speaking to Abraham, and we find them in the prophet Isaiah in chapter 45. Because what we discover as we read the Old Testament is that God is a God who makes promises. And in particular, what I want us to think about today is God is a God who makes covenants. Now, covenant isn't a word we use greatly in the modern world. We use the language of contract a bit more commonly. They're not quite the same, really. A contract is rather transactional. It's about usually the transfer of goods or services. A covenant it's a binding promise, but it's a relational thing rather than a transactional thing. So thinking about it as contract will only take us so far. I want to show you 3 different covenants in the Bible as we explore this idea of why we can have hope in our current world. And maybe a question to begin as we start to think about this is, why would God choose to bind himself? God is a God who has created. He's a God who has grieved over the destruction and the damage to his creation and the harm that his created beings are doing to one another. Why would he choose to bind himself to such beings? So let's start with the story of Abraham. And this is really the very beginning of God's big story of saving the world. And he begins with one man. And in Genesis 15, we read this rather... it's quite difficult to understand because it's a very ancient ritual, but let me just read you a few verses from Genesis 15. The Lord said to Abraham, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. So just pausing for a moment, we've got these animals and we've cut them in, Abraham's cut them in half and he's separated the halves and he's kind of created this thing with an aisle down the middle, if you like. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. So this really is a very odd thing for us to be reading about and trying to imagine, but this is the way that covenants were made, at least some of the time, in the ancient world. And what would happen is that they would do exactly what we've just read. They'd take the animals, they'd cut them in half, they'd separate the pieces, and then the two parties usually would walk together down the middle. Sometimes it would be, if it was a covenant being made after a military conquest where you've got a more powerful party and a less powerful party, you know, a kind of sovereign and a vassal, it might just be the vassal who walked down the middle. But the idea is, as you walk down the middle, you are effectively swearing a kind of an oath against yourself, and you are saying effectively, if I break this covenant, may I be treated like these animals have been treated. May it happen to me as it has happened to these animals. So that's the convention that we're reading about. But let's just think about the story again briefly. So God instructs Abraham to do this. Abraham separates the animals. I skipped a couple of verses, but he kind of falls into a trance or a deep sleep. And then he sees a blazing torch going down the middle. At no point does Abraham himself go down the middle, but what he sees is a blazing torch. Now this is what's known as a theophany. This is an appearance of God in the Old Testament. And when God appears in the Old Testament, he often appears as fire, smoke, wind, trumpet blast, thunder, lightning, and one other thing that I've forgotten. There's 7 things. But anyway, that sort of cluster of phenomena. And here we have it. Here we have a blazing torch. We have a smoke and fire. And so this vision that Abraham has is of God making the covenant and God being the one who acts as its guarantor. He is the one, if you like, who is saying, if I break this covenant, or if this covenant is broken, may it be unto me as to these animals. Hold that thought. because there's a very rich theological idea being opened up here, which is going to track us right into the New Testament. Now, so God makes this binding promise to Abraham. Remember my question at the beginning, why would God choose to do this? And maybe the question gets deeper now. Why would God choose to act as the guarantor of a covenant which he knows that humans are going to break? So let's go on and we read about Abraham's descendants and about God making, or renewing if you like, the covenant with that nation. This is soon after they've come out of Egypt. If you know the story of Moses going and the power of God enabling him to bring the people out from under Pharaoh's thumb. And he brings them to Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, if you'd been standing there among the people, what would you have seen and heard and smelt? You'd have seen and heard fire and smoke and thunder and lightning. That's a theophany. So God has presenced himself on this mountain. And let's read these words. And I'm reading from Exodus chapter 24. Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws. And they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. And he got up early the next morning and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain. And he got some young men to make sacrifices, picking up at verse 6. And he took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. And they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words." So what do we see here? We see the theophany. We see covenant being made in blood. This is always the convention in the Old Testament. And we see, if we know the story, we see that God is making this covenant with a people that he knows are going to break it. And they're going to break it almost immediately, because we get the golden calf story quite soon after this. And that's Exodus 32, if you want to look that up. But we see a people who are going to break that covenant again and again and again and again and again. And God makes a covenant with a people he knows will break it. And he himself is the guarantor of that covenant. Now, if that language of Moses, "This is the blood of the covenant," if that sounded familiar to you, then good, because you'll probably know it from the Gospels. Let me read to you from Mark 14. And these words are spoken as Jesus is sharing his last meal with his friends before he goes to the cross. And at the end of that meal, after he has broken bread and shared that with them, he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So here we see the new covenant being made. It's not displacing the old one, it's fulfilling the old one. It's making the old one bigger and better and more lasting and more durable. But it is God who is the upholder of that covenant, because we, his people, are not faithful. And this is the testimony all the way through. Let me finish with these words from Hebrews 6. I'm picking up on those words that I opened with, where God said, "By myself I have sworn." Hebrews 6, when God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, "I will surely bless you and give you many descendants." And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. People swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. We have a God who reaches into history and acts in real time. A God who makes promises and covenants he has no obligation to make. A God who acts as the guarantor of those covenants, despite the fact that his people do not keep them. a God who upholds and maintains those covenants in his own blood. And this is why we can have hope.